I was only the palace maid until the Alpha King walked past every princess to find me. There were 12 of them lined up in the Great Hall that morning, daughters of the most powerful packs in the known world, dressed in silk and gold, and the particular confidence of women who had been told their entire lives that they were exactly what a king required. They had traveled weeks to stand in that hall. Their fathers had negotiated for months for the privilege of their daughters being considered. The Alpha King walked in and looked at none of them. He walked the length of that hall with the unhurried certainty of a man who already knew what he was looking for, past 12 princesses who had prepared their entire lives for this moment, and he stopped at the end of the hall where I was standing against the wall with a water pitcher in my hands and dust on my dress from the morning's cleaning. He looked at me the way you look at something you have been searching for across a very long time without knowing exactly what it was until you find it. The hall went completely silent. I looked behind me because surely he was looking at something else. He wasn't.
He said.
One word.
No explanation.
No apology to the 12 princesses whose futures had just rearranged themselves around a palace, maid holding a water pitcher. I had served in the palace of Ethon for 6 years without anyone looking at me directly. I had learned to move through rooms like furniture, present but unnoticed, useful but invisible. The most powerful man in the known world had just made me visible in front of everyone who had ever looked past me. And from the expressions on the faces of 12 princesses, I understood immediately that being seen was going to come with a cost I hadn't yet been told the full price of. My name is Saren, and I had no history worth telling when the Alpha King chose me. That is what I believed then. I had been brought to the palace of Ethon at 11 years old, a child from a ruined village in the outer territories whose parents had died in a pack raid that left nothing standing but ash, and one small girl who was quiet enough and quick enough to survive it. The palace steward had taken me in not out of kindness, but out of practicality. The palace always needed hands willing to do the work that more important people considered beneath them. I had spent 6 years becoming very good at that work. I knew which floors needed replacing before they creaked. I knew which candles burned longest in the east wing drafts. I knew the precise angle at which to carry a full water pitcher through a crowded corridor without spilling a drop. I knew how to be in a room without being in a room, which was the most valuable skill the palace had ever required of me, and the one that had kept me safe across 6 years of navigating a court where the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of person could end badly for a girl with no family and no pack to speak for her. The Palace of Ethon was the seat of power for the entire known world, the place where the Alpha King ruled over every pack, every territory, every bloodline that carried the wolf inside it. It was also a place of extraordinary cruelty beneath its extraordinary beauty, where status was the only currency that mattered, and those without it were furniture at best and targets at worst. I had been furniture for 6 years. On the morning of the choosing ceremony, I had been assigned to the Great Hall to ensure the water pitchers were filled and the torches were lit before the princesses arrived. It was a task deliberately assigned to the lowest-ranked maids, a reminder of our position on the day the most important women in the world came to stand in our hall. I had been finishing the last pitcher when the doors opened. I had been standing against the wall when he walked in. And I had been looking directly at him, which I should not have been because maids did not look directly at the Alpha King when he turned and looked directly back. His name was Kale. Alpha King Kale of Ethon, son of the war god Marin, ruler of 37 packs across 6 territories, the most powerful supernatural being in the known world. He looked at me like I was the only person in the room. And every carefully constructed wall of invisibility I had built across 6 years of survival crumbled in the space of 1 second. The 12 princesses did not move when he walked past them. They were too well trained for that. Daughters of Alpha Lords did not flinch or reach or show need in public, regardless of what they felt privately. They stood in their silk and their gold and their careful composure and watched the Alpha King walk the full length of the hall without slowing, and not one of them let the devastation of it show on their faces. I saw it anyway. 6 years of reading rooms had made me fluent in the expressions people wore over the ones they were actually feeling. I saw the moment each princess understood he was not stopping for her. The precise instant the future she had traveled weeks to claim receded like a tide going out. I felt it. More than I expected to, which surprised me. Then he stopped in front of me, and I stopped feeling anything at all except the specific paralysis of someone who has become unexpectedly visible in a room full of people who have spent years not seeing them. He was taller than I had understood from a distance. The paintings in the palace corridors had captured his face accurately, the sharp jaw, the dark eyes that carried the particular quality of someone who had seen everything and chose carefully what to show in return. What they had not captured was the weight of his presence, the specific gravity of a man whose bloodline carried the war god's mark, which I felt as a pressure in my chest before he had said a single word. He said one word, her. And the pressure in my chest became something else entirely that I did not have language for. The steward, a rigid man named Aldrich who had spent 20 years managing the palace with the particular pride of someone who considered himself an extension of its dignity, moved forward immediately with the expression of a man managing a catastrophe that he did not yet understand. My king, Aldrich said carefully. This is Saren. She is a palace maid. She is not among the candidates presented for the choosing. I know what she is, Kale said. He had not looked away from me. And I know what she is to me. The hall was so silent, I could hear the torches. My king, Aldrich tried again. The protocol for the choosing requires. Bring the protocol to me and I will revise it, Kale said, with the particular flatness of a man who had not raised his voice because raising his voice had never been necessary. She comes with me.
Now.
Aldrich looked at me with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, disbelief, professional humiliation, and something that looked uncomfortably like warning. I set the water pitcher down on the nearest surface with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, which was either composure or shock wearing composure's clothing, and I was not yet certain which. I looked at the 12 princesses once as I followed Kale toward the doors. I had not planned to look. My eyes simply moved there, the way eyes move toward things they know are significant. Princess Vara of the Northern Pack was the closest. She was the most powerful of the 12, daughter of the strongest alpha lord outside Ethon's own bloodline, and she was looking at me with an expression that had moved past the devastation of the moment into something considerably more focused and considerably more dangerous. She was not sad. She was deciding something. I understood. Following the Alpha King through the great hall doors while 12 futures rearranged themselves around a palace made with dust on her dress, that whatever had just been given to me in that hall had also just made me a target in ways I did not yet have the full picture of. The doors closed behind us. Kale stopped in the corridor and turned to face me and looked at me with the same expression he had worn across the length of the great hall, direct and certain, and carrying something underneath it that I recognized, after a moment, as relief. As though he had been looking for a very long time and had finally stopped. You felt it, he said. It was not a question. I thought about the pressure in my chest. The something else I had no language for. I felt something, I said carefully. I don't know what it was. You will, he said. My king, I said, because 6 years of palace service had made the title automatic. I am a maid. I have no pack, no bloodline, no family name. Whatever you felt in that hall, I think you may have. I have never been wrong about anything my blood tells me, he said. Not arrogantly. Simply as a statement of fact from a man who had lived inside the certainty of his own nature long enough to trust it completely. And my blood has been telling me something was missing for 29 years. He looked at me in the corridor light with the particular attention of someone who had found the answer to a question they had stopped expecting to resolve. It stopped telling me that, he said, the moment I walked into that hall. I stood in the corridor outside the room where 12 princesses were still standing in their silk and their gold, a girl with no pack and no name and dust on her dress, and felt the ground of every assumption I had ever made about my own life shift beneath my feet. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, we find out who you are. It was the most terrifying and the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me, because I had spent 6 years being very certain that who I was did not amount to much. And the Alpha King of Ethon was looking at me like that certainty was the only thing in the room that he was confident was wrong. They gave me a room in the East Wing. Not a maid's room. Not the narrow corridor quarters I had shared with 5 other girls for 6 years, with a single window that faced the kitchen yard and let in more smoke than light. A room with actual curtains. A fireplace that worked. A bed large enough to feel like a statement rather than a necessity. I sat on the edge of it that first night, and looked at the ceiling, and tried to locate the version of my life that made sense of where I currently was. I could not find it. The palace had erupted quietly, which was the specific way palaces erupted when the people inside them were too controlled to erupt loudly. By evening, the corridors carried the particular energy of contained scandal, conversations that stopped when I walked past and resumed the moment I was far enough away to be discussed. Maids who had worked beside me for years looked at me with expressions I had never seen directed at me before, a mixture of things too complicated to separate cleanly. The 12 princesses had been installed in the South Wing guest quarters pending the Alpha King's formal announcement. Their fathers had been invited to remain for a feast that now carried an entirely different weight than the celebratory one they had anticipated. I had been informed of none of this officially. I had learned it the way I had always learned things in the palace, by being in rooms where people forgot I was present. Old habits. On the second morning, a woman named Thessaly arrived at my door. She was the Alpha King's head advisor, silver-haired and precise, with the particular composure of someone who had navigated decades of court politics without being destroyed by any of them. She looked at me with an expression that was carefully neutral in a way that told me she had strong feelings she had decided not to show. "The king has requested that you join him for the morning audience," she said. "I don't know how to behave in a morning audience," I said.
"I'm aware," she said.
"That is why I am here an hour before it begins." She spent that hour teaching me with the efficient patience of a woman who understood that the situation was what it was and complaining about it served no one. How to stand, where to position myself, what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. How to read the room when the room was full of alpha lords who had very specific feelings about a palace, maids sitting beside their king. "They will test you," Thessaly said, near the end of the hour.
"Not openly.
Not with words you can respond to directly. They will make observations that sound like compliments and ask questions that sound like curiosity. You will know what they actually are." "I've been reading rooms like that for 6 years," I said. Thessaly looked at me for a moment with the first expression that wasn't carefully neutral. "Good," she said. The morning audience was held in the great receiving chamber, a room I had cleaned many times and never sat in. Kale was already at the head of the long table when I arrived, the alpha lords arranged along its length in the order of their pack's seniority, 12 powerful men whose faces I recognized from years of serving their meals and whose names I now had to learn as equals rather than employers. I sat where Thessaly had indicated, to Kale's right, which was a position that carried its own statement and which every man in the room registered and filed. Princess Vara's father, Lord Cashin of the Northern Pack, spoke first. He was a large man with the controlled authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice because his voice was already the loudest in every room he entered simply by existing in it. "My king," he said pleasantly, "we are of course honored by whatever direction the choosing has taken. However, tradition requires that the mate of the Alpha King carry a bloodline capable of producing heirs of sufficient strength. A girl with no documented bloodline. Her bloodline," Kale said, without looking up from the document before him, "is not your concern." "With respect," Cashin said, "the strength of the next generation of the ruling pack is every alpha lord's concern." The table was very quiet. Kale set down his document and looked at Cashin with the particular stillness of a man deciding how much patience the situation deserved. "Lord Cashin," he said, "I have ruled these territories for 11 years. In that time, I have not once made a decision that required your approval. I do not intend to begin today." He picked the document back up. "Her bloodline will be established through the proper channels in the proper time. Until then, she sits where she sits. Are there other matters for this morning?" Cashin sat back. The table moved on, but I felt his eyes return to me twice more before the audience ended, and both times they carried the expression his daughter had worn in the great hall the previous morning. Not grief. Something being decided. After the audience, Kale walked with me briefly in the corridor outside the chamber, the first time we had spoken since the hallway the previous day. "You held yourself well," he said. "Thessaly prepared me," I said. "Thessaly prepared the surface," he said. "What's underneath the surface is yours." I looked at him sideways, the way you look at someone you are still calibrating. "Lord Cashin is going to be a problem," I said. "Lord Cashin has always been a problem," Kale said. "The difference is that now his problem has a face and a name and a reason to pay attention to him." "Me," I said. "You," he said. We walked in silence for a moment. The palace corridor was doing its ordinary business around us, servants and advisors moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who had adjusted to the new situation faster than their expressions suggested they had. "You said yesterday that we would find out who I am," I said.
What did you mean exactly?
Kale was quiet for a moment that felt considered rather than evasive. The fated mate bond does not attach itself randomly, he said. It follows bloodlines. Ancient ones. Ones that carry something the gods decided needed to find each other across generations.
He paused.
A girl with no documented bloodline does not simply appear in a palace. She arrives there for a reason. I intend to find out what that reason is. I thought about a village in the outer territories. Ash, and one small girl walking away from it. What if the reason is simply that I survived something terrible and ended up somewhere that needed cleaning?
I said.
Kale looked at me with an expression that was the closest thing to warmth I had seen from him. That, he said, is not what the bond tells me. I walked back to the East Wing room with the working fireplace and the curtains and the bed that felt like a statement, and I sat on its edge again and looked at my own hands and thought about bloodlines and reasons and a village I had spent 6 years not thinking about because thinking about it led nowhere useful. For the first time in 6 years, I let myself think about it and found, sitting inside the memory I had kept closed, something I had not examined since I was 11 years old. The night the village burned, my mother had pressed something into my hand before she ran back into the fire. I had lost it in the chaos of the following days. A small thing. A carved stone that had been warm against my palm, even in the cold night air. I had forgotten it entirely. Until now. Until a king told me I had arrived somewhere for a reason, and my memory, unprompted, produced the one detail from the worst night of my life that I had never been able to explain. Why had a carved stone been warm? I found Thessaly that evening in the records room. She was exactly where I expected a woman like her to be at the end of a complicated day, surrounded by documentation and doing something useful with it. She looked up when I came in with the expression of someone who had been wondering when I would arrive. "Sit down," she said, before I had said anything.
"Iset."
"Ask what you came to ask," she said. "The village of Kerith in the outer territories," I said. "It was destroyed in a pack raid 18 years ago. I was 11. I need to know which pack raided it and why." Thessaly set down her pen. "That is a specific question," she said carefully. "I have a specific reason for asking it," I said. She looked at me for a long moment with the expression she had briefly shown that morning, the one underneath the careful neutral, and then she stood and moved to the shelves along the far wall where the territorial records were stored in the ordered system of someone who had been filing them for decades. She pulled a volume and brought it back to the table and opened it to a page she found without searching, which told me she had either an extraordinary memory or she had known this page was coming before I arrived. She turned it toward me. The record of the Kerith raid was 3 paragraphs in the dry language of official documentation.
Date.
Location. Casualties. Authorized by. I read the last line twice. Authorized by the High Council of Alpha Lords, pursuant to the suppression of a bloodline designated a threat to the established order of the known world. Suppression of a bloodline? I said. Yes, Thessaly said. My bloodline? I said. Thessaly folded her hands on the table.
Saren, she said.
What I am about to tell you is information I have held for 18 years because the person it concerned was 11 years old and had just lost everything, and I did not believe a child needed the weight of it added to everything else she was already carrying.
You knew, I said.
You knew who I was when the steward brought me here. I knew who your mother was, Thessaly said. Your mother was the last surviving daughter of the Solari line, the bloodline of the sun gods chosen. A line the High Council declared extinct 18 years ago because its existence complicated their authority in ways they were not willing to manage. The room was very quiet. They raided my village to kill my mother, I said. Yes, Thessaly said. And she set me away first, I said. Yes, Thessaly said. I thought about the carved stone, warm against my palm in the cold night. A stone my mother had pressed into my hand before she ran back. The stone she gave me, I said. What was it? Thessaly's expression shifted into something that looked, on a woman of her composure, remarkably close to reverence. The Solari seal, she said. The mark of the sun god's line. If you carry it or carried it, it means your mother passed the full inheritance to you before she died.
She paused.
It means the bloodline the High Council declared extinct 18 years ago is sitting in this records room, asking me questions. I sat with that for a long time. The Alpha Lords on that council, I said. Lord Cashin of the Northern Pack. Was he among them 18 years ago? Thessaly looked at me with the specific expression of someone watching a person arrive at a conclusion they had been hoping they would reach on their own rather than being handed it.
He'd chair the vote, she said.
I stood up slowly. Does the king know? I asked. The king knows you are his fated mate, Thessaly said. He does not yet know the full weight of what that means for the court or why Lord Cashin looked at you the way he did in that audience this morning. She paused. I think it is time he did. I walked to the door and then stopped. Thessaly, I said. Why did you keep this for 18 years? Why not tell someone? Tell him. She was quiet for a moment. Because the last time someone knew, she said, a village burned. I walked out of the records room and through the palace corridors toward the king's private chambers with the particular focused calm of a woman who had just discovered that her entire life had not been a series of random survivals, but a single continuous act of protection by a mother who had run back into a fire so that her daughter could one day walk out of it. And somewhere on those outer territory roads 18 years ago, I had lost the one thing that proved all of it. Or had I? I pressed my hand against the small pocket sewn into the lining of my old maid's dress, the one I had kept without understanding why, the one I had worn to the choosing ceremony, because it was the only thing I owned that was clean. My fingers found something small and smooth and inexplicably warm against my palm. I had not lost it. I had simply forgotten I was carrying it. Cale listened without interrupting. That was the first thing I noticed, that he was the kind of man who understood that some information required the full space of its telling before it could be properly received. He sat in the chair by the window of his private study and looked at me steadily as I told him everything Thessaly had shared, and he did not reach for his advisor or his counsel or any of the apparatus of authority that powerful men typically reached for when information arrived that required managing. He simply listened. When I finished, I placed the carved stone on the desk between us. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. The Solari seal, he said. Yes, I said. Thessaly confirmed it.
She didn't need to, I said.
She recognized it the moment I described it. Her expression did the confirming before she said anything. Cale reached out and picked up the stone carefully. The way you pick up something you understand has weight beyond its size. The moment it left my palm, I felt the absence of its warmth with a specificity that surprised me. He turned it over once and set it back down. The High Council authorized the Kareth raid 18 years ago, he said. It was not a question. Cashin chair the vote, I said. Something moved through Cale's expression that was not the controlled stillness I had seen in the Great Hall or the morning audience. Something underneath the controlled stillness. A specific kind of anger that belonged to a man who had just understood that something had been happening inside his kingdom for 18 years without his knowledge. I was 18 when the Kareth raid was recorded, he said. Still learning the throne. The High Council managed the territorial decisions in my early years. I signed what they brought me. Did you know what you were signing? I asked. He looked at me directly. I was told it was a rogue pack suppression, he said. A village harboring wolves who had broken pack law. He paused. I signed it. The room was quiet. You didn't know, I said. Not knowing is not the same as not being responsible, he said, with the particular moral weight of a man who held himself to standards he applied without exception. I signed a document that authorized the destruction of a village and the murder of a woman whose daughter ended up cleaning my floors for 6 years. I looked at the stone on the desk between us. She ran back into the fire, I said. My mother. She pressed the stone into my hand, and she ran back. I never understood why until tonight. She ran back to ensure they believed the bloodline was destroyed with her, Cale said quietly. She sacrificed herself to protect the inheritance she had just passed to you. I had known this, in the abstract way you know things Thessaly has just told you. Hearing it from someone else made it land differently. More completely. More permanently. I pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed. Cale did not offer comfort, which I found I was grateful for. He simply waited, the way he had waited through the telling, with the specific patience of a man who understood that some things needed space rather than response. Cashin knows who I am, I said, when I was ready to speak again. He recognized the Solari bloodline the moment you chose me. That is what he was deciding in the Great Hall. Yes, Cale said. He will try to remove me before you can formally establish my position, I said. Yes, Cale said. How quickly can you move? I asked. Cale looked at me with the expression I was beginning to recognize as his version of being caught off guard by something I had said, the brief recalibration of a man who had spent 11 years surrounded by people who asked him what he planned to do and had not encountered someone who asked him how fast he could do it. The formal bonding ceremony requires 3 days of preparation under pack law, he said. It cannot be accelerated without giving the High Council grounds to challenge its legitimacy. 3 days, I said, during which Cashin has full access to the court and full knowledge of what I am. Yes, he said. Then we need to know what he's planning before he plans it, I said. Kale was quiet for a moment. You think like a strategist, he said. I think like someone who has spent 6 years in a palace full of people who would step on her if it was convenient, I said. The only difference is that now it would be inconvenient for them. Something moved in his expression again, that thing underneath the controlled stillness, except this time it was not anger. Thessaly, he said, standing. We need Thessaly. She's still in the records room, I said. She was waiting for us to finish.
He paused.
How do you know that? Because she's been managing this information for 18 years, I said. She is not going to leave the building the night it finally moves. Kale looked at me across the desk with the carved stone warm between us and the weight of 18 years of hidden history rearranging the shape of everything. Saren, he said, whatever happens in the next 3 days, whatever Cashin moves, I need you to understand something. What? I asked. The bond chose you before I knew your bloodline, he said. The bloodline changes what this means for the kingdom. It does not change what you mean to me. I looked at the stone. I thought about a mother who had run back into fire. I thought about 6 years of being furniture in a palace that had apparently been built in some ancient and deliberate way to be the place I was always going to end up. 3 days, I said. Let's not waste them. Cashin moved on the second day. He was too experienced to move on the first. The first day he had spent in the South Wing with the other Alpha Lords and their daughters, presenting to anyone watching the composed patience of a man waiting for official clarification of an unprecedented situation. He attended the evening meal. He made conversation. He congratulated Kale with the warm measured grace of a lord who accepted outcomes he privately found unacceptable and had no intention of remaining unacceptable for long. I watched him from the other end of the table and understood every word of the performance. He moved on the second day, through Princess Vara. I found this out not through Thessaly or Kale or any of the official channels of palace intelligence, but through a girl named Mira, who had been my closest companion among the palace maids for 4 years and who arrived at my east wing door that morning with the specific expression of someone who had heard something they knew I needed to know and had run the full length of the palace to deliver it. Princess Vara met with her father's courier before dawn, Mira said, breathless from the stairs. The courier carried a sealed letter out of the South Wing. I didn't see who it was addressed to, but Lena from the night staff said the courier's horse was saddled for the Eastern Road. The Eastern Road led to the Temple of the High Council. Thank you, I said.
Mira.
Whatever happens in the next 2 days. You did not tell me this. Mira looked at me with the expression of someone who had known me for 4 years and was rapidly recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the girl they had known. Be careful, she said simply and left. I brought the information to Thessaly, who brought it to Kale, and the 3 of us spent the following hour in the records room around the territorial maps working through the implications. The High Council convened only when summoned by its member lords or by the king himself. If Cashin had sent a letter to the Eastern Temple, it meant he was calling a convening, which he had the authority to do as the senior Alpha Lord, which meant he intended to challenge the choosing through official council channels before the bonding ceremony could be completed on the 3rd day. What grounds? I asked. Insufficient bloodline documentation, Thessaly said. It is the same argument he made in the morning audience, and it is technically legitimate under council law. If he can force a convening before the bonding ceremony, the council has the authority to delay the ceremony pending a bloodline review. How long does a bloodline review take? I asked. As long as the council decides it takes, Thessaly said. I looked at the Solari seal on the table where I had placed it while we worked. Unless the bloodline is already established, I said. Unless the documentation already exists and cannot be challenged. Thessaly and Kale both looked at me. The Solari records, I said. The original documentation of the bloodline before the High Council declared it extinct. Where are those records? Thessaly was very still for a moment. The council ordered them destroyed 18 years ago, she said, along with everything else connected to the Solari line. Did you comply with that order? I asked. A pause that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "Thessaly," Kale said quietly. She stood and moved to the far wall of the records room, to the section where the oldest volumes were stored, their spines worn and their colors faded into the particular gray of things that had been on shelves long enough to become part of the shelf. She reached behind a row of territorial census records and produced a box I had never noticed in 6 years of cleaning that room. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside were documents that smelled of age and something older than age, the specific quality of things that had been written when the world was being decided rather than managed. Genealogical records. Temple certifications. A lineage chart that stretched back to the sun gods first chosen in the ancient world. And at the bottom of the stack, a birth record. My birth record. My mother's name. My father's name, a name I had never known because he had died before I was old enough to ask. And my name, written in the formal script of the Solari temple, with a seal pressed in gold at the bottom of the page. Saren of the Solari line. Firstborn daughter of the last chosen. Marked and recorded in the sight of the sun god on the day of her birth. I looked at my name on a document 18 years old and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for as long as I could remember. Not because the document made me important, but because it made me real in a way that 6 years of being furniture had systematically tried to undo. "Can this be challenged?" Kale asked thusly. "Temple certifications of this age and this seal cannot be legally challenged under any council law," Thessaly said. "The council can declare a living bloodline extinct. They cannot retroactively invalidate a temple record." "Then we file it today," Kale said, "before Cashin's courier reaches the Eastern Temple. Filing it requires a witness from outside the palace," Thessaly said. "Someone with independent standing. A lord, a high priest, or a bonded alpha." I thought for a moment. "Lord Edrin of the Western Pack," I said. He sat at the far end of the table during the morning audience, and he looked at Lord Cashin twice, with a specific expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to outmaneuver him for a very long time. Kale looked at me. "You read that from his expression during a single audience," he said. "I told you," I said. 6 years. Kale almost smiled. It was the first time I had seen anything close to it, and it landed somewhere in my chest alongside my name on an 18-year-old document, small and warm and entirely unexpected. "Get Edrin," Kale said to Thessaly.
"Now."
Thessaly was already moving before he finished the sentence. Lord Edrin arrived in the records room within the hour. He was a compact, quiet man with the particular alertness of someone who had survived decades of alpha lord politics by being the one in the room who noticed things other people missed. He looked at the documents on the table, looked at me, looked at Kale, and sat down without being asked with the efficiency of a man who had already assessed the situation and decided where he stood before he arrived. "The Solari line," he said, looking at the birth record. "Not a question." "You recognize the seal," Thessaly said. "My grandmother served in the Solari temple when I was a child," Edrin said. "I know the seal." He looked at me steadily. "I also know what the High Council did 18 years ago, and I have known it was wrong for 18 years and said nothing, because saying something required a reason strong enough to survive what Cashin would do in response."
He paused.
"This is a sufficient reason." He signed the witness certification Thessaly had prepared with the deliberate permanence of a man who understood he was signing something that could not be unsigned and had decided that was precisely the point. The documents were filed with the palace's official record keeper by midday. By the following morning, when Cashin arrived at the Great Hall for the day's audience with the particular confidence of a man whose courier had reached the Eastern Temple and who was therefore certain the convening was already in motion, Kale placed a copy of the filed documentation on the table in front of him. "Cashin, read it." The Great Hall was silent in the specific way it goes silent when something significant has just shifted and everyone in the room is processing the size of it. "The bloodline documentation is filed and witnessed," Kale said. "The bonding ceremony proceeds today as scheduled. The High Council convening, should it still be called, will be presented with this documentation upon arrival and will find nothing to review." Cashin set the document down with the controlled care of a man managing the fact that the ground he had been standing on had just been removed from beneath him. "My king," he said pleasantly, "I have no objection to the bloodline documentation. I am of course delighted to welcome a daughter of the Solari line." His eyes moved to me with the warmth of a man who had spent decades making hostility look like hospitality. It is quite extraordinary. A Solari heir in the palace all this time. Indeed, Kale said. One might wonder how she came to be a palace maid rather than in her rightful position. The pleasantness on Cashin's face did not change, but something behind it went very still. A mystery for another day, he said smoothly. Not a mystery at all, Kale said. The High Council authorized the destruction of Kareth village 18 years ago on the grounds of bloodline suppression. The record of that authorization, including the name of the lord who chaired the vote, is also now filed with the palace record keeper.
He paused.
I thought it should be documented alongside the birth record, for completeness. The hall was utterly silent. Cashin sat very straight in his chair, the pleasant expression still on his face, the thing behind it entirely different now, the look of a man doing rapid calculations about how many moves he had left on a board that had just changed completely. He had one move remaining. He took it. My king, he said, with the smooth pivot of a man who had been in courts long enough to know when to change direction without appearing to change direction. The events of 18 years ago were the decision of a full council acting on the information available at the time. As you yourself noted, you were young, and the council managed many territorial decisions in your early years. A pause. Surely accountability for those decisions rests collectively rather than individually. Collective accountability is a fascinating argument, Kale said. We will explore it thoroughly during the formal inquiry I am opening into the Kareth authorization this afternoon. Cashin looked at the table.
Then he looked at me.
It was the longest he had looked at me directly since the Great Hall on the morning of the choosing, and this time there was nothing being decided behind his eyes. The decision had been made for him. I held his gaze without difficulty because I had spent 6 years learning to hold the gaze of people who looked at me like I didn't matter, and I was very good at it. And also because I was looking at a man who had ordered my mother's death and had spent 18 years believing it had worked, and I had things I wanted him to understand without saying them. He understood. He looked away first. After the audience, Kale walked with me in the corridor and did not speak for a moment, which I had learned in the past 3 days was his version of processing something before putting words to it. The formal inquiry will take time, he said finally. Cashin has allies on the council. It will not be simple. Nothing worth doing is simple, I said. You are remarkably unbothered by the scale of what you are walking into, he said. I was bothered earlier, I said. In the records room, when I read my birth record. I was bothered then. What changed, he asked. I thought about my mother pressing a warm stone into my hand before running back into fire. About 6 years of cleaning floors in a palace that had been, without anyone knowing it, keeping me safe until the moment I was needed. About a king who had walked past 12 princesses and stopped at the end of a hall and said one word that had rearranged everything. I understood. I said that everything that happened was pointing here. And here doesn't frighten me. He looked at me with the expression underneath the controlled stillness. The bonding ceremony is in 3 hours, he said. I know, I said. Are you ready? He asked. I thought about the question honestly rather than reaching for the automatic answer. I have been surviving things I wasn't ready for since I was 11 years old, I said. I think being ready is overrated. He almost smiled again. Closer this time than the first. The bonding ceremony happened at sunset in the temple courtyard. It was smaller than I had imagined, which surprised me until Thessaly explained that the bonding ceremony of an Alpha King was not a public spectacle but a sacred rite, witnessed only by the Alpha Lords and their households and the palace's senior staff, which meant the people in that courtyard were exactly the people who needed to see it most. I wore white. Not the elaborate constructed white of the choosing gowns the princesses had worn, but a simple ceremonial dress Thessaly had produced from the palace's ritual wardrobe, clean and unadorned, which suited me better than decoration would have because I had spent 6 years learning that the thing itself was more important than what you wrapped around it. The 12 princesses stood in a group to the left of the courtyard. I did not look at them directly, but I was aware of them the way you are aware of things that are working out how to feel about you. Vara stood at the front of the group, and the expression she wore was the third version I had catalogued from her, not the devastation of the Great Hall or the dangerous decision of the morning audience, but something newer and harder to read, something that might, under different circumstances and with more time, have been grudging respect. I did not assume it was, but I noted the possibility. The high priest of the pack god conducted the ceremony with the economical reverence of someone who had performed sacred rites often enough to understand that the power was in the rite itself and not in surrounding it with performance. Kale stood across from me and I stood across from him, and the priest spoke the old words over us in the language that predated the known world's current territories, the language the gods had apparently used when they decided that certain people needed to find each other. When Kale took my hands, I felt the bond between us shift from the pressure I had first felt in the Great Hall into something more settled and more permanent. Not louder, but deeper. The difference between a sound you hear and a sound you feel in the bones. He looked at me across the right with an expression that was entirely unmanaged for the first time since I had known him. No controlled stillness, no careful authority. Simply Kale looking at me the way he had looked in the Great Hall, like something that had been missing for a very long time had finally stopped being missing. I looked back at him with everything I had, which turned out to be considerably more than I had understood I was carrying. The priest completed the rite. The bond settled into permanence. The courtyard was silent for a moment in the specific way that silences are silent when something significant has just become irreversible. Then Lord Edrin began the formal acknowledgement, and the other lords followed, each one in the order of their standing, their acknowledgements ranging from the genuine warmth of Edrin himself to the precisely calibrated correctness of men who understood that the situation was now fully established and their options had narrowed to acceptance or consequence. Cashin was last. He stood before us and looked at me with the composed expression of a man who had made his calculations and arrived at his position. "My king," he said. "My queen." The word queen directed at me from the man who had authorized my mother's death landed with a weight I had not anticipated, and I absorbed it without showing what I was absorbing because I had 6 years of practice, and because showing it would have given him something he didn't deserve. I inclined my head with the specific measured grace Thessaly had spent 3 days teaching me, precisely enough to acknowledge, and not enough to concede. He stepped back. After the ceremony, in the quiet that followed the departure of the lords and the princesses and the palace staff returning to their ordinary business, Kale and I stood in the empty courtyard under a sky that had moved from sunset into the first dark blue of evening.
"It is done," he said.
"The ceremony is done," I said. "The inquiry is not." "No," he said. "Cashin will face what he deserves to face. It will take time, but it will be thorough." "I know," I said. We stood in the cooling courtyard, and I thought about my mother, about whether she had known, when she pressed the stone into my hand and ran back into the fire, that the thing she was sending her daughter toward was this. A courtyard at sunset, and a king who had walked past 12 princesses, and a bond that the gods had apparently decided needed to happen. "Do you believe in destiny?" I asked. Kale considered the question. "I believe in bonds," he said. "I believe in what the blood knows. Whether that is destiny or simply the accumulated weight of choices made across generations arriving at their conclusion, I am not sure the distinction matters." "My mother chose to run back," I said. "That was her choice, not destiny." "Yes," he said. "And you chose to set down the water pitcher and follow me out of the Great Hall. Also a choice." "It didn't feel like a choice," I said. "The best ones rarely do," he said. I looked at the sky and felt the bond settled in my bones and the carved stone warm in the pocket of a ceremonial dress where I had placed it before the ceremony because it seemed like the right thing to carry into the moment. "Kale," I said. He looked at me. "What you said in the study," I said. "That the bond chose me before you knew the bloodline. That the bloodline changes what this means for the kingdom, but not what I mean to you." "Yes," he said. "I need you to know," I said, "that I understand the difference between those two things and I intend to hold you to it." Something in his expression moved toward the smile that had been arriving in increments since the records room. This time it arrived completely. It was a better thing than I had anticipated, which given what I had been anticipating was saying something. "I would expect nothing less," he said. "The formal inquiry into the Kareth authorization opened 6 weeks after the bonding ceremony. 6 weeks during which the palace recalibrated itself around a new reality the way palaces do, slowly and visibly, and with the particular combination of grace and resentment that institutions produce when change arrives faster than they were prepared to accommodate. I recalibrated too. Not into someone different. Into someone more fully myself, which turned out to be the most demanding thing the palace had asked of me, more demanding than 6 years of cleaning and carrying and being furniture, because becoming visible after years of invisibility required a kind of daily courage that I had not known I would need to practice. Thessaly helped. She continued the education she had started in the hour before the morning audience, expanding it from how to stand in a room to how to hold a room, from surface preparation to the deeper work of understanding what ruling actually required from a person who had not been raised to it. "You have something most people trained for this role do not have," she told me one morning over the territorial maps. "What?" I asked. "You know what it costs," she said. "The people who clean the floors and fill the pitchers and move through rooms like furniture. You know their names. You know which floors creak and which candles burn longest and which corridors are coldest in winter." She paused. "A ruler who knows those things governs differently from one who does not." I thought about Mira, who had run the full length of the palace to bring me information on the second morning because 4 years of working beside me had made her trust me with something that could have cost her everything. "Mira," I said. "She should be promoted. Head of the East Wing staff." Thessaly looked at me. "She's 17, she said. "I was 17 when I understood this palace better than people twice my age," I said. "Promote her." Thessaly made a note. The inquiry moved as inquiries move, methodically and without drama, the evidence accumulating in the official record with a particular unstoppable quality of documented truth that has been waiting 18 years for someone to look at it properly. Cashin's allies on the High Council fell away from him in the order of their self-preservation instincts, which varied in speed, but arrived at the same destination. The evidence of the Kareth authorization and its true purpose was not something that could be reframed once the Solari birth record and the temple certification were part of the official record. The council had declared a bloodline extinct and sent men to a village to make it so. The woman they had been sent for had known they were coming, had sent her daughter away, had run back to ensure they believed their mission was complete. The daughter was now queen. The record could not be rewritten around that fact. Cashin stood before the full inquiry on a morning in late autumn and gave the account of a man who had run out of alternate versions of events and was now simply presenting the one that remained, the true one, wearing the face of a man who had spent decades believing that what was expedient and what was right were the same thing when he was the one deciding. He was removed from his position as senior Alpha Lord. His territories were placed under council administration, pending restructuring. Princess Vara attended the inquiry's final session with her father and watched the proceedings with an expression I could read clearly by then, because I had been cataloging her expressions since the Great Hall and had enough of them to understand the pattern. She was not her father. She was a woman who had grown up inside her father's world and was now, in the public collapse of everything he had built on a lie, quietly and privately separating what she had been raised to believe from what she had decided to believe herself. After the session, she crossed the room to where I was standing and I pressed my hand against the pocket where the carved stone sat, warm as it had always been, warm as the night my mother pressed it into my hand before she ran back into the fire to give me a world worth running toward. I had found it. I intended to build something worthy of the price she had paid for it, starting with a temple, starting with a name on a stone. Starting with a palace maid who had learned to move through rooms like furniture and had turned out, in the end, to be the most load-bearing thing in the entire structure. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If you love stories filled with mystery, love, betrayal, and impossible twists, subscribe and come back for another unforgettable journey.